hello, everybody. Thanks for being with us today. We're really excited to talk to you. I'll talk about who we are first. We're Argo Visa. We're the first company that's made up of ex-visa officers who used to work for the State Department in the embassies and consulates around the world, adjudicating visas. There are 25 of us in total. 4 of us are here today to talk to you about H1B visas. We've got a wealth of experience that I hope is going to be very useful for you in your journey towards getting your H1B visa and starting your career in the US. Hopefully, we're talking to you today and you've already been selected in the H1B lottery. Congratulations. And now we're going to be talking to you about the interview process. You've had your petition approved in the US, and now you're scheduling your appointment abroad, and you're going to go in, and we're going to help you with some tips and some of our knowledge that's going to help you be able to get through that interview process smoothly and get your visa and get on your flight to the US as quickly as possible without any hiccups. My name is Ben Ardebrun. I'm the Director of Consular Affairs at Argo Visa. I was a former visa officer with the State Department for 6 years. I started off my career in China, in Guangzhou, which was the busiest visa post in the world at the time that I was serving there. I did non-immigrant visas, which H1B is one of them. I also did immigrant visas. I worked in American Citizen Services. I followed up that with a tour in Bogota, Colombia, where I also did non-immigrant visas and worked in the fraud prevention unit, where we did the investigations into any cases where the officers weren't sure about some credentials or some documents. So I got a great perspective on how that's done during that time in Bogota. After that, I was the spokesperson and press secretary at the consulate in Shanghai before leaving the State Department in 2018. Since then, I've been helping people get their visas all over the world and all types of visas. And I've been working with Argo for nearly 2 years now. Yeah, 60,000 visas over the course of my career with the State Department. Let me throw it over to Mariola. Mariola, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ben, for the introduction. My name is Mariola Janik. I'm a former visa officer in Brazil. My posts were Sao Paulo and then Rio de Janeiro. And then I was also able to do short-term assignments in other countries like Cuba, Jamaica, Ecuador, and Argentina. So I have a wide variety of experience in the Western Hemisphere Affairs region, working on all sorts of visa and hundreds of H1Bs as well, so can speak from that perspective. And in total, I adjudicated just around over 75,000 visas. So I'm looking forward to hearing what sort of questions we have here today, and I hope we can share as much insight as possible from our experiences.
Great, thanks. Anna, would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, I'm Anna Kerner Anderson. I served in both Juarez, Mexico, and then after that in London. In Juarez, I served in the non-immigrant visa section for a year, the immigrant visa section for a year. And then in London, I also served a mixture of both in the IB and the NIV section. I'm currently an immigration attorney, so I kind of know things from both sides, both perspectives, both internally as a consular officer and now on the outside as an immigration attorney. And so I'm also looking forward to seeing what questions you might have as you prepare for your visa interview.
Great. Thanks, Anna. And Swati.
Yeah, hi, everyone. So my name is Swati Patel Vasan, and I have been working with Argo and consulting for them for a little bit now, and also doing my own consultancy because I have 14 years of government experience. So I actually, before doing consular work with State Department, I was also an immigration officer with Justice Department, Homeland Security, so have adjudicated a ton of green card and citizenship types of applications with them, and then joined State Department where I did consular work in addition to other kinds of portfolios. My consular tours of duty were in Honduras and also in India. And during the course of and I did policy work related to consular stuff back in headquarters with State Department. So I have about 7 years of just consular related experience, of which maybe I've done about 75,000 different kinds of visa adjudications from all sorts of NIV categories to immigrant visas, citizenship, and everything in between. So.
Thanks, Swati. And I know that you having your experience working in India is going to be really valuable for our watchers today, since 75% of the H1Bs around the world are issued to people in India. So I know it's very competitive, and it's one of the most desired visas in that market. So let's get into our discussion. We're talking about the H1B visa, and luckily, if you've already been selected through the lottery, the issuance rate in the end is very high. Only a few percentage points of applicants actually get refused their visa in the end and don't get it, but that doesn't cover the entire story. There is actually quite a high number, maybe around 20% of applicants that go through some sort of 221G administrative processing where they don't get their visa issued right away, where there's going to be a snag, paperwork's not right, they don't issue your visa right away because you weren't prepared at the visa interview. We want to help you avoid that. Of course, in the end, we want to help you avoid getting refused, heaven forbid. But we also want to help you get your visa as soon as possible because, this is your career. This is a job that's waiting for you on the other end that may or may not be understanding about the entire visa process and, the holdups that can occur during that. So when I was adjudicating H1B visas in China, there's kind of a culture in the embassy, in the consular section of how these visas are going to be adjudicated, whether it's going to be strict, whether it's going to be more lenient. The approved petition is really all that is needed to issue that visa. And then when someone comes to their visa interview, you're basically verifying that the person in front of you is indeed the person with the qualifications that were presented in order to get that H1B visa. And one of the main things that people would get held up for was if their English language ability was not as strong as the officer thought that it should be. Right? Maybe there's a person that's going to be working in statistics, and so they're not actually going to be using their spoken English all that much. Their written English is very strong, but then you put them into the environment where it's high stakes. You're at a visa interview. You've got all these people in the waiting room. There's a lot of noise. Someone's talking to you through this microphone, and the speaker quality isn't good, and so your English isn't as fluent as it can be, and that can cause a holdup. There's not much that can be said about that one. I'm starting off with this one that there's not much to be said about, but you do need to make sure that you're prepared for this very kind of uncomfortable, noisy environment to be able to demonstrate your English skills, because that's the number one thing that they can use just right on the surface to judge whether or not someone is qualified to work in a U.S. workplace, is whether or not their English skills are up to par. Did anybody else find that same thing, that same standard applied in the post where you were adjudicating visas? Mariola, in Brazil, was that an issue, or were there other issues that you found were more important to the adjudicating officer?
I think it always would boil down to just make sense. As long as you would come prepared and were able to kind of explain what you were about to do and just had some sort of proof that, you studied in an area related or not necessarily related. It can be a very straightforward interview if you do come prepared and are able to present yourself in a way that is clear and makes sense and doesn't raise any red flags. What might raise a red flag is some sort of inconsistency in your career path, but otherwise it should be a fairly straightforward interview for you if you come prepared and are able to present yourself in a way that makes sense.
Swati, what were some red flags that would have popped up when adjudicating H1Bs in India?
Yeah, so India is very interesting that way because you were seeing a lot of like a whole slew of candidates that were in this new age range, these because of the industry that H1Bs kind of was targeting. So a lot of, you would see a lot of young 20-year-olds that were working for BPOs, right, in the booming kind of economy of IT and what was kind of being exported. So somebody who would not normally come for a B1, B2 at that age is now applying for an H1B right now because based on work. So what we would see generally is, they would need to really know, the challenge would be for them to not be clear on being able to explain what their current job position is, what they're going to be doing as well. It wasn't so much not being aware of what their salary was going to be, but it was being able to articulate what exactly do you do for that company. And it's in here, at least in India, the English language wasn't such a big issue because it's such a primary language here and for the kind of work that people do here as well. and in the education system. So it more boiled down to just being able to articulate and connect the dots, like why only you for this particular position, why not somebody else? And when it came to a question like that, sometimes the applicants would freeze up, and they have to be able to say like this, confidently know about their job and what they're actually doing, what they're going to be doing.
That's a good point. There was this applies to a lot of visa classes where people have lawyers preparing these petitions for them, and it kind of feels like, oh, other people are preparing this, and other people are going to make sure that this works for me and that it's going to go through. But then I think a lot of visa applicants for all these visa classes, but especially H1Bs as well, don't realize that when you go in for the interview, your lawyer's not there, your employer's not there, the agent isn't there. It's just you. And you have to take on all of those roles and be able to answer any question that the consular officer puts to you. Now, there's always the possibility that it might be a question that you can find the answer to later, but then you've got yourself put into 221G. And that's not, if that can be avoided, it's best to avoid that. So, you've got to be prepared. You've got to know the content of the petition. You got to know the names of the people, the person who's at that company, whose name is on there, the salary that's on that petition. And like you said, if there's anything that's not consistent among different documents, that's going to raise eyebrows. A lot of the consular officers have a kind of a law enforcement mindset with it, and so they're looking through these documents and they say, oh, it says $4,000 a month here, but here it says $3,500 a month. This doesn't match up. What's the problem here? What's the real number, right? So your lawyer's been paid, the company has been taking care of this, but you need to go through just with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that you know everything in that petition, and also that everything looks right. If there's something wrong, it's your responsibility. You've got to go tell the lawyer, tell the company, hey, this data doesn't match up in my petition. I don't want there to be a problem. Let's get this straightened out beforehand.
Yeah, can I just add something further to that, especially country-specific context, is that because India is the #1 sending company of country of H1Bs, and the slew of kind of companies there are here, and sometimes the other branch of that company is applying for them, especially these big conglomerates here like TCS, and the Indian market will know the ones I'm talking about. But the thing at that time is that it's your responsibility as an applicant also to make sure you are working for a bona fide company. And that really applies here, very much so, because in India, especially, you would see a lot of H1B petitions rejected. And even now we see a lot of cases that come back where, at some point they ended up taking a job like with kind of an unscrupulous company. And now it's catching up to them, and they're finding visa revocations and difficulties at port of entry and stuff. So you have to be very careful as an applicant, not to be padding your resume. You want to be very honest about how it all correlates, and do your homework and go to work for a legitimate H1 company. That onus comes on you as an applicant.
I'll just add to that. From my experience, also, I think the other thing to keep in mind is if you're working for a third-party company, if you're not going to be working directly for the H1B petitioner, you may have already gone through an RFE, and like Ben mentioned, the attorney might have already handled that, and you think that's been handled, but be prepared for that to come up again in the interview, because that is a red flag. That is something that consulates look at to make sure that there is, a legitimate hiring entity, and there is that employer-employee relationship. So be prepared to answer those questions again if you experience that, through an RFE, or if you are not going to be working directly for the petitioner. Just make sure that you're prepared to answer those types of questions as well during the course of the interview.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that you've just got to be prepared to answer these questions. You need to know something that you might not usually know as an employee. The structure of the company, is a subsidiary, is there a parent company? These are things that you have to know when you go into this interview if you want to get through without a hitch, without a 221G or even worse. Anna, from your perspective, being an immigration attorney as well as a former consular officer, in your experience in Mexico, were there any issues that you think that came up that could have been avoided by applicants that we haven't talked about already?
I mean, the main issues are the ones that we've kind of already covered. Like everything needs to make sense, and obviously you need to be able to talk, very succinctly and clearly about what you're going to be doing. I think those were the most common hiccups. The language, we did most of our interviews in Spanish, even if they were H1B cases, so that didn't really come up for us in Mexico. But again, the whole package. I always tell my clients, now on this side, the whole package needs to make sense, right? The officer needs to say, okay, the story makes sense. So, again, if there are questions about your employer, if and a lot of times you will know if there's been questions with other employees, your colleagues have had issues with your employer, be prepared to answer those questions, because then obviously your case is probably going to be flagged too, and you're going to have to answer those questions. So in Mexico, we saw that, if there were large employers that were employing multiple H1B applicants, then obviously if there were no issues with them, then that made the next adjudication much easier. But if one had been flagged as a potential not bona fide employer or some issues with employment in the United States, then you're going to have to be prepared to answer those questions. So, I mean, you probably know if your case is marginal or not, and so you're just going to have to be more prepared if it is.
Yeah, definitely. There's the side where the employer could have some issues that's going to cause you to have some problems. But then there's also the side where you have to prove that you are the person with the qualifications that you said that you have in order to get that visa. And some applicants go in and just their natural personality leads them to be more talkative and able to just on their toes answer these questions about their credentials, their experience, their qualifications, and others are more introverted and maybe have been told, hey, you just need to be as reserved as possible, and you need to just give simple answers. So they ask things like, well, tell me about your background, engineer. These types of questions where really when they start asking you about your background, it's basically enter job interview mode, right? Basically, you're trying to tell them, hey, this is why I'm so qualified that I got this H1B and why I'm actually a legitimate candidate for it, right? So my advice is always, just really focus on it like it's a job interview, like you're trying to convince the consular officer that you really are skilled enough to do the job, because that is exactly what you are having to do during that interview, right? And even if you think, oh, well, I have a very specialized field and they won't understand the research that that I do with terms of like, I don't know, optics when it comes, I don't know. So we'll say something that's very, very specialized, optics in, optics in projectors or something like that. Just use the very specialized language from your field, right? Talk extremely confidently and knowledgeably about whatever your field is to show that, okay, yeah, this person does have the credentials that they're reporting in order to get this H1B, right? Mariola, did you have any experiences that you thought somebody might have been able to be better prepared for, or anything that was Brazil specific?
Yeah, sure. I was just to piggyback off of your comment there. I can recall visa officers, trying to dig and to get specific information, and you try to want to leave the burden off the officer to have to dig around and do the work for you to kind of figure out the specifics, and you want the officer to just kind of not have to ask so many questions because it's going to get complicated for them. They just want to hear the answer right away, as specific and coherent and succinct as possible, right? So as you were saying, Ben, if you hear an answer like, oh, I studied engineering, it's like, okay, well now the visa officer has to do its, investigative work to figure out, okay, well you studied engineering and you're doing something very specific now in computers or security, something, can you please connect the dots for me, like Swati was saying, right? So maybe right off the bat, say something, well, I studied this specifically and I took courses in this, which led me to X, Y, Z, landing this position, maybe being specific about how did you find this opportunity? How did you get this job? You want to be prepared with those specifics so the officer doesn't have to do all the digging to get to the answers, because you have to keep in mind that the officer is probably exhausted, just wants to figure out what you're doing as fast as possible and doesn't want to ask a lot of questions because that can, creates a lot more work for the officer, and you want to diminish that.
I would just add to that. I always tell my clients, in addition to being very specific about what you're doing so that it appears that you are a specialist and what you're supposed to be a specialist in, add like a simple example that can explain to the officer in layman's terms what you're doing too, because if you get too technical, it shows that you know your stuff, but it also leaves the officer wondering what you're actually going to be doing, and they kind of have to be able to connect the dots. So I always advise my clients to do both, explain it technical so that it appears that you do possess the expertise that you're supposed to possess, but then also leave the officer with a concrete example so that they can kind of understand what it is that your technical expertise is and how it applies to the real world.
Just wanted to piggyback off of something Mariela said. So I like to tell applicants that you have to think of every question as an opportunity. It's your opportunity to tell us more and give us relevant information that we otherwise wouldn't have. And it's even more important for people that may have been denied. So, you need to tell us something more elaborate, that's something we may not otherwise know. And the visa officer will also tend to cut you off and move on to the next question when he or she feels that they've received or they've gotten the information, or they're not going to get it and they're going to move on to the next thing. But you want to take that as you have a minute or two of an interview and that's it. So in that much time, the least number of questions you get asked is actually good, because that means you're using those questions to give a fuller response that's relevant. And I think that's really important for applicants to kind of understand that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Swati. Anna, since you're the immigration attorney, could you talk a little bit about dual intent when it comes to an H-1B visa? Because I know a lot of people will have had other visas they've applied for, maybe immigrant visas, and how that's going to play a role.
Sure. I'll speak. When we were in London, we had a list on the side of our cubicle that said, what visas we couldn't apply 214B to. And so, officers that were new to H1B adjudications would glance over that and see, okay, I can't apply 214B, so immigrant intent doesn't matter. So it shouldn't really come up in your interview at all, really, because it's not an applicable reason for an officer to deny a case. But yes, sometimes if it comes out in your application in your DS 160, or if you verbally say it to an officer during the course of your interview that you have a green card pending, as some of you might be, especially if it's an H1B renewal, you might have an I-140 pending. I always get questions about that in my private practice. If the officer's going to be aware of that, the short answer is usually probably not, unless you've disclosed it in some way to the officer, because USCIS is very separate processing than the State Department until you're at a certain stage in the process. An officer is probably not going to even be aware that you have a green card pending. But you want to make sure if they ask that question, to obviously be forthcoming and answer that question correctly and appropriately, because you don't want that to impact your case further down the line. As I always tell my clients, everything that you say to a consular officer goes into a consular officer's notes and can always come back in a later interview for a different visa type or the same visa type or renewal. So you always want to make sure to be forthcoming and honest in the interview. But as far as immigrant intent, it shouldn't, H1B, as most of you probably know, is a dual intent visa, and you're allowed to possess immigrant intent at the time of the H1B interview and at the time of being H1B visa holder. So if you do get questions about that, it's not going to impact the overall outcome of your visa, and you should just answer appropriately and correctly to any questions about that.
Just to further elaborate on what Anna said, but on your DS 160, make sure you fill that out correctly and honestly. That's very important. So if you do, there's a place in there, that may ask you about the relatives in the US, or has anyone ever filed an immigrant visa petition for you? So if you have actually an immigrant visa petition, you do not want to lie on that form. So I just want to make sure that's clear as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. The easiest way that a consular officer is going to refuse someone is if they know something to be true and they ask you and you say it's false, right? It's surprising how many people ask me, oh, I've got a sister in the US. Should I tell the consular officer that if they ask? And I say absolutely, because they may already know. If your sister's in the US, they applied for a visa, right? They may have listed their relatives and they know that you're related. And then they ask you this question and you say no. They don't need any other information to base a refusal on, or a recommended revocation on. right? Let me think if there's anything else that we wanted to address. I think we've covered a lot of the topics that I wanted to cover today regarding like the general stuff that's going to apply to the majority of our listeners who are going into their consular processing for their H1B. So Davis, if you're there, can you come back to us and let's see if we've got any questions that have been coming in from our viewers.
Yes, exactly. We have some questions, and also if you have additional questions that you've thought of during this, you can send them in the Q&A if you're on Zoom, or if you're on Facebook, you can comment them on the Facebook stream. But so the first question is, there's a lot of talk about, need to be confident and prove yourself. Is it possible to be too confident where it comes off in a negative way?
What do you think, Mariola? Is it possible to be too confident?
I mean, I think the worst that you can do if you come off too confident is maybe annoy the officer, but I don't think coming off too confident is necessarily a bad thing, as long as, again, it's the content of your answers that I think matters a little bit more in that case. Of course, you want to come in with a positive attitude. You want to be confident. I've never seen an instance where someone, I mean, you don't want to irritate the officer. I would say that, right? I don't think you want to be rude. I think you want to be respectful, respect the process, and hopefully that's reciprocated, right? But I think if you come in with positive energy, a positive attitude, and are confident, I think you can't go wrong, as long as the rest of your case and facts of your reality are consistent. I've rarely seen that be a negative, only maybe when an applicant becomes defensive and aggressive. I think that's where you have to be a little bit careful. But again, being confident, good, but maybe coming across as aggressively with an attitude, not so good, because again, as Anna was saying, the officer can write whatever they want, right? And they could potentially say, this was a rude applicant. Keep that in mind in the future.
Yeah, and I would just add, I don't think most officers like their authority questioned. So that would be, it's good to be confident, but just don't be, aware of the authority the officer has as well, right? And be, respectful of that. I think an officer, will respect if you're confident and you show that you're, a good professional and that you know your stuff, but also they want to be respected and they want to, kind of have the recognition that they have your future in their hands. I don't think I was that type of officer, but I know there were a lot of officers that were like that. They wanted the authority of the position of consular officer respected. So just keep that in mind too, I would say.
That's very true. That brings up a good point that culturally, the amount of assertiveness or differentiality is different to different cultures, but the visa interviews are always with Americans, and Americans appreciate someone who's going to be a little bit more confident talking about their credentials and qualifications, rather than someone who's extremely deferential and timid. So, you do have to adapt to that American standard when you go into that interview. Great. Davis, do we have another one?
Awesome. So this is actually a question we tend to get in almost all of our webinars, but what is like an appropriate thing to wear to the visa interview, and will this ever make a difference in the decision?
Whoever wants to can take that one.
I always tell my clients it should make sense to what your position is going to be, right? So business casual is usually a kind of a go-to. In my first post in Mexico, my supervisor told me, if they're going to be a student, then they, you would expect them to be dressed in casual attire. If someone's going to come for an H1B interview, you're a professional, right? So you should dress accordingly to what would be the attire, that would be expected for your profession. So business casual is usually kind of the in my experience, both in London and Mexico, was kind of the expectation for someone that was applying for a work type visa and going to be working in a professional capacity.
And just to further add to that, you also want to be comfortable in your clothes. So whatever you feel most confident in and at your most natural self, because that, remember, is going to give you the more it's ease to be able to converse and have that brief conversation with the officer is if you're feeling natural. So if you're used to, you're a student and you're used to wearing jeans and you're going to study for your bachelor's, it's kind of expected. You would wear it, like Anna said, you're the type of visa. If you're going for an H1B, you're expected. You're in an office environment, so it's relevant to the position. But if you were a student and you're dressed in a business suit and showing up, it's not really going to make sense. And you're probably not going to feel like a student applying for a student visa. So just keep that in mind as well.
I was helping someone get a visa in China, helping them apply for their visa. And they were a retired professional skateboarder who owned a skate shop and put on all these skateboarding events with Vans and Converse, all these skateboarding brands. And he was applying for his visa to go to the US to meet with these companies and do some collaborations. And I said, what are you going to wear? And he said, well, he'd bought a shirt and a jacket to wear. And he's got long hair and tattoos. And I just thought, that they're not going to believe that at all. Just dress like you normally do. Dress like a skater. You're a skateboarder. You're going to collaborate with these skating companies. Just dress like you normally do. And the whole story is going to make sense.
Great, and thanks for the story too. It's always interesting to hear more of the background. Another thing is, so Swati mentioned, maybe you have 1 or 2 minutes to talk. Could you give a little more information about, what to expect in the time frame? Because people are a little like, what? It's that short? So yeah, that would be helpful.
Sure. So you have to remember, excuse me, depending on where you're applying from, the consulates and embassies are pretty busy, right? So as Mariela was saying, you want to help make their process easier. Maybe they're exhausted. So imagine that the visa officers are doing, let's say, 100 interviews a day. Okay, some a lot higher than that, I suppose, and some less than that. But so they have to be efficient. Okay, it's not that. They have to try to understand, the requirements per the visa category that you're applying for. Okay, so they only have a brief period to do it. So in that time, they're trying to assess that. So that's why it's just 1 or 2 minutes. If there was the ability to have a nicer, longer conversation with you, then they would probably be able to get a lot more information from you as an applicant. And as an applicant, you may feel, not as nervous, and you'll be able to easily talk about what you want. But that's why it's so important in how you succinctly kind of address the question and give that relevant information. So that way you can have a good interview. The other thing that to further elaborate on that is that a lot of people say that, oh, they didn't even look at my documents. Okay, we get that like all the time, right? So what I try to tell people is that it's not so much about the documents. Certain visa categories, yes, by law require a document. For H1Bs, obviously, there'll be the petition, right? The approved stuff. So F1, you need your your I-20, your CVSP. But beyond that, it's usually supporting evidence. Okay, so even if somebody that's been denied gets asked, if you ask somebody who got approved, they probably will say, yeah, they didn't really look at my documents. But a lot of times the applicants feel, they've been told otherwise, either from agents or forums or friends, like, oh, carry this, carry that, carry this. Okay, so what happens, what it translates to is in the interview, the applicant is fumbling in their plastic bag for all these kinds of documents. So what I would recommend in that sense, to make that 1 or 2 minute interview as good as possible, as efficient as possible, is you take what is required of you only, and you make sure that's organized. So if that officer is asking you, for example, in your H1 interview, let me see your salary slip, let me see your employment offer letter, those kinds of things that are relevant to your case are ready and organized, and you can easily refer and give it to the officer. So those are my 2 cents.
Great, no, that's really helpful. And especially talking about the documents, I know people have a lot of questions about that. So we have a question that I'm just going to read word for word. So this person says, I found that the visa officer could be rude sometimes for no reason, or maybe for a reason that I didn't know. His or her questions were very aggressive. What can I do to address this during the interview?
I think this is sort of, Swati already touched on this, but if you think about it, in Brazil, you know, a country where we have posts that get a lot of volume, high volume, you know, thousands of applicants a day that are waiting, you know, over an hour in the line, and you know, you probably hear it in the news, the major backlog, you know, that we have with, you know, applications. So if you think about, you know, the work of the officer within like a factory, right? It's a repetitive process. There are thousands of applications per day, and that team and that person is doing that repeatedly, similar questions over and over and over again every single day. You know, it can be a very exhausting and draining process for the officer, right? So I think naturally what might happen, what happens to you, you know, when you're doing something repetitively over and over again, you know, a very tough process that's very exhausting, that requires you to think and do a lot of things all at once, to multitask, you get tired. And sometimes when, you know, what I was talking about earlier, the sort of cooperation or the applicant making it easy for the officer to hear the sorts of specific questions, this and that, you may get a little bit of, you know, an officer that may not be able to deliver on customer service, right, for every single interview, just because they're probably exhausted. They've probably, you know, had to hear the same things over and over again, right? So maybe to be prepared for that can happen, and not to take it personally, right? But to, again, as we've been saying, you know, to prepare as much as possible, practice. And one thing that I wanted to mention that I didn't get a chance to say earlier is it could be a red flag, but try to avoid repeating the same sort of response over and over again. So what do? I'm an engineer. Well, what does that mean? I'm an engineer, right? So maybe to avoid that sort of, maybe the rudeness or the toughness from the officer, that sort of preparation, and to just be patient and to stay calm in the moment.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up on that by saying that type of behavior by the officer, it's unprofessional and it's inappropriate. However, it's not uncommon, because the managers don't focus on that as something that they're trying to control. So yes, there are officers that behave that way, and you just need to know that there's nothing you can do to change it, and you still have to do everything you need to do to get your visa. So if they're rude to you, if they're impatient with you, you still have to be polite and responsive to them. Because the most important thing is that you get your visa, right?
Just to add to that, so also to remember that in the case in this case, the person who might have posed the question, if you've had this kind of experience already, to know that if you do reapply, by law, the officers are required to make sure your case gets to a new, fresh set of eyes. So you won't get the repeat officer. That won't happen, because they will have, even if by chance you got it, that officer will give it to another officer. So you will have a fresh interview. And the other thing I would recommend, and this happens, I see it a lot, is where you're already nervous when you're going to, for your visa interview, okay? But where you can help yourself not to increase your nerves is when you're standing in that line of whatever the process is for that particular consulate or embassy. A lot of people work their nerves up further when they're looking at the different windows, and they're thinking to themselves, well, that person didn't get their visa. That applicant looks really upset leaving the window. Oh, that person, and so they project it onto themselves, or they look at the officers if they can see them and say, oh, well, that one's really rude, or I hope I get her because she seems really nice and friendly. So that just what happens is, I would recommend you not get yourself involved in that kind of trap. Instead, just kind of focus on, okay, what is it you're prepared? What is it that you need to focus on for yourself, your own case? Do not worry about what the other external factors are that are going on.
Great. Thanks so much for all of your insight on that. So the next question is, someone is asking, after the H1B is approved by one employer and then you transfer to another employer in the same carrier field, would this cause issues during the interview?
Did you ever have any experience with this, Anna?
Yeah, I was just, not so much on the consular side, but as an attorney, of course. I mean, it shouldn't. You're going to have to, we commonly refer to it as a transfer, but in reality, it's a brand new application. You have to file a new LCA. You have to do all of the same petition, everything all over again. And so all that information is going to be on that petition. USCIS will have adjudicated that. So when you get to the interview, the same rules apply, right? You're going to have to be able to explain what you're going to be doing. You might get some more questions about when did you depart the United States to come back to do the transfer. So I think sometimes officers, we're stationed where we're doing the interview, so we don't quite understand that people might be living in the United States and coming back just for the visa interview. I remember when I first did, my first few H1Bs or other work-based visas, I was surprised that the person wasn't living in the country that I was doing the adjudication, right? So you might get some questions about that. And that might throw the officer off a little bit if they understand that you just flew back for the interview and you're going directly back to the United States. But again, that's all legally allowed. Just be able to explain that, right? That you're changing employers. And so you came back to get your visa issued into your passport. I know Indian nationals like to always say visa stamping, which isn't really what it's legally called. Sometimes, depending on where you're interviewing, that can throw an officer off too, because, it's not just a stamping. We are adjudicating the visa. And so I think sometimes officers think that's a little bit too informal when you say visa stamping. So just keep that in mind as well. But really, the same rules apply for a transfer as they would for an initial application. You're going to have to, speak professionally about what you're going to be doing and answer all the same similar questions.
Great. Okay, so we have two more questions. One is a little specific. So this question is specifically about China, and they're asking about the NIE application and like how that works. And I think this may apply to other countries as well. But yeah, what is the policy? How does that work for H1Bs?
The policy for NIE in China is the same as it is for everywhere else. But what I would add is that all of the other China-specific policies also apply. There are a lot of policies right now that are affecting Chinese students and Chinese H1B holders that block them from being able to get a visa, depending on where they've studied, where they've gotten funding from, and what their field is. So all of that still applies, even if you're going to apply for an NIE expedited visa request. And also, they've allowed direct travel from China based on the NIE application. And so that's one of the things that is allowed, direct travel from China and the other countries that do have direct travel bans due to COVID. There's the NIE exception to that. Anna, do you know anything else about that you would like to add?
No, I don't really have anything further to add on that. I think you covered most of it, yeah.
Okay, great. So we have one last question, and if you aren't able to join us live for this Q&A and you're watching this later on, you can reach out to Argo at our email, hello@argovisa.com, or you can follow us along on our social media channels and leave a comment or send us a message if you're not watching this live. But the last question is about 221G, as you've mentioned. What kind of are the stakes of this? Like, what happens? Is your case over? What happens once you get in 221G? What can you do to get out of it? What happens? Yeah.
When you're in 221G, it basically that's the a very specific way of saying they didn't make a decision right then, right? So they didn't say issue, they didn't say refuse. They said, I'm going to do something with it later and then make a decision afterwards. And what happens after that, just so you know how this works on the inside, it's all on the officer to then follow up with your case. Sometimes there will be internal procedures that make sure that things get followed up on in a timely manner and don't get lost, don't fall through the cracks and just sit there with no action taken on them. But other times there isn't, and individual officers and their organizational abilities will actually determine what happens with your case after that. If you applied and you were 221G'd at your interview and you haven't heard anything for weeks, you should follow up and contact the embassy or the consulate, because it could be that officer started to do some work on your case, started to do some research, and then went to lunch, and then came back and there was another problem case that they needed to do research on that arrived on their desk, and they started working on that one. Then another one arrived, and yours is at the bottom of the stack. When you email, though, That'll notify the officer, hey, someone's has asked about this case. Has it been adjudicated yet? And they're going to find it and they can take action. There's so many people, especially right now during COVID, when things are just so not standard all around the world. This can happen and is happening to a lot of people. Don't just sit there and just wait for 2 months without any word from the embassy or consulate. Get in touch with them. You know, they have their public email, they have the form submission on the websites, through the third-party scheduling contractors that you have a way that you can contact them. Get in touch with them. It's not going to hurt you to write and say, hey, I had my interview 10 days ago and I haven't heard anything. What's the status? That's not going to hurt you. You're not going to offend them by doing that. But you do need to make sure that you follow up.
Just something else on the 221G, at least here in India, I noticed that a lot of times if you're 221G, it can also be, it's not just for the internal administrative processing. It can be because in order to continue further adjudicating your case, you're missing something relevant to it, relevant to that officer making the decision on your H1B. So if that's the case, the officer will tell you, you know, I still need, you're missing your employment letter, or I need the salary stubs from this, or I want, et cetera, et cetera. So they will then let you know that this is what you need. So if you get told something like that, then make sure you follow through with it on your end and you submit it back again to the, you know, embassy and consulate, so that they can then match it to your case and continue adjudicating it. So in a case like that, when you get asked for something specific, it's generally, you know, you're just about to get approved, but you're missing X, Y, or Z kind of thing. And once you submit X, Y, or Z, okay, we're okay, we can approve it. So that's sometimes what happens with 221Gs.
Thanks, Swati. And then before you wrap it up for us, Davis, I would just like to say, if anybody's got a situation that is very unique that you think is causing you problems or causing you to worry, get in touch with us and we can most likely help you, because we've seen so much, we've seen so many of these applications. There's very little that is new to us that we haven't seen before. If you've been refused a visa before and you don't know if it's going to affect your future application, if you've got a pending complex, out of the ordinary immigrant visa petition that you don't know how it's going to affect it, get in touch with us. We're more than happy to help you navigate this process.
Great, thanks so much, Ben. And yeah, as Ben said, we have a huge team of ex-visa officers with experiences around the world. And feel free to reach out to us through our email, hello@argovisa.com, or you can go to our website, www.argovisa.com. But Argo, we really like to thank Anna and Swati and Mariola all for joining us today and sharing some of your insights and experiences across the world. It's really valuable knowledge for a lot of people. So we appreciate your willingness to take some time today to share. And for anyone who's not live, again, feel free to send your questions through the comments or our email. And we wish everyone luck in their H1B process and hope you have a success. So thanks so much, everyone, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.
All right.